Welcome to part 3 of vMix training, everyone. Good to see you all here. You don't need to stay muted the whole time, though. This is interactive. I want you all to interrupt me if I say anything that you are confused about or have questions on. So yeah, feel free to say hi right now.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
To start off, GT title designer, what is it? Does anyone know?
I believe the vMix guys put it as MS Paint on steroids.
True. That's fair.
I say it looks like a UI builder of sorts. That's
Yeah.
all. Period.
No, that's true. So vMix GT title designer, or just GT title designer, or GT for short, as people might say. Make it in GT, throw it in GT. They'll use that as a shorthand. Is the graphics integration tool for vMix. So you can design graphics in here. I wouldn't recommend that. I'd recommend doing it somewhere else and then bringing it into vMix GT. But designing it in GT is not really the way to go. Generally, GT Title Designer is used for compiling graphics assets together and forming them into one dynamic graphic to use inside of vMix. So why would you use vMix GT Title Designer? Why not just export the images directly and load them into OBS or vMix? So there's a few reasons. One is dynamic data. You can use data from real-time sources like a spreadsheet and change the graphics live. And this is super important for things like scoreboards, lower thirds, really any text that needs to be updated over the course of a broadcast. And then number 2 is performance. So GT titles are made specifically for vMix, and you can combine many elements into one GT title instead of needing to create multiple image inputs and layer them all together inside of vMix. And then number 3, and kind of the biggest one, not the biggest one, the second most important to me, is animations. So normally to animate graphics, you would need to handcraft an animation in something like After Effects and export a PNG sequence or a transparent video file and then import that. And those are kind of demanding to play for some reason. Instead, you can animate in GT. It's very performant. So something to note that a lot of you probably don't know is that GT Title Designer is actually 3D software, but it's mostly used for 3D or for 2D graphics since the 3D capabilities are pretty limited. But first, let's explore the interface. So I'm going to delete this. On the left side, we've got a bunch of different things, a bunch of different sources. Number 1 is the mouse. Now, this actually isn't a source. It's just the default selection to move things around. So if you have the mouse selected, you can click, you can drag, you can do whatever. If you have something else selected, you will be creating that object. So number 2 is text. And this is one of the most used sources in all of vMix GT. When you create a text source, all of the options are up in the Home tab. So let me show you that here. You can click and drag to create a text box when you have ABC selected. It automatically goes back to mouse once you create it. This little blue tab up here, you can grab onto it with that. You can grab onto it anywhere really, but this blue tab is helpful if like there's layers overlapping on each other. So this blue tab will always be grabbable in that instance. Here in the Home tab, you can see we've got all the usual stuff. I'm not going to get into all of it because I assume all of you know how to use a text editor for the most part in terms of text wrapping. We'll go into these options in a second, though. Over here, the Arrange panel on the right side here, this just quickly lets you change which layer source is on top or reposition it. Just quick buttons. So like you could bring it forward a layer, backward a layer, but you can also do that by dragging in this sidebar here. So you can use these buttons to move the layers up and down or drag around the sidebar. So let's say we have 2 text sources. Ooh. You can just click and drag in this side here to change which one is on top. There's also a dock button, which just has a few options: top, fill, left, right, bottom. So you can dock it on the bottom, you can dock it on the top, you can dock it to fill the entire space. So now this text box is exactly as big as its group layer canvas. Another option is to create a group layer. And when you click create group layer, what this does is it creates another group layer, but it is always sized exactly to the size of the source it's being applied to. So if I select this text block, you can see how its outline is a certain size. If I click create group layer, now we have another group layer, and it is the exact size that that text block was. This is useful for various things, mostly animation. Sometimes you can animate the sources and everything's just fine, but you can also animate the group layers. So you could have, let's say, the group layer fly in, and you could have the text layer fade in. So it would be fly in, fade in. Whoa, it's crazy. So you could have two going at the same time without needing to use the 1, 2, 3 system, which we'll get to. But the 1, 2, 3 system is hell. So if you can avoid it is what I recommend. So there's also a few other options. So under effects, these effects can be applied to any source, not just text. You can see we can adjust the opacity, so make it more or less transparent. I'm going to make this text bigger so we can see it better. Effects, opacity, shadow. There's a few options. If you're used to Photoshop, you'll be like, wow, this is not very many options, and you are absolutely correct. Bottom left, smooth, pretty good shadow option. You can adjust the alpha level of it and the color of it, so usually like a 50%. Bottom left, smooth, nice subtle drop shadow. You'll notice a theme. The theme is that GT is good enough, right? It does the things and it's good enough. It could be better. It could certainly be better. And anyone that uses this tool regularly will tell you that a million times. We also have reflection. We add a little bit of reflection. It's kind of cool. And it's based on the size of the bounding box of the source. So if the bounding box is really big, the reflection will start at the bottom of that bounding box. And if you want it to line up perfectly with the text, then you got to make the bounding box line up perfectly with the text. Now it's a neato reflection. We can also skew, which also stacks with the reflection, as you can see. We can flip things horizontally or vertically. We can mask. And masking, if you've ever used After Effects or something like that, masking just allows you to have one layer dictate what is visible through another layer. So let's cover masking after we go through all of the sources. Next up is rectangle. Now, the rectangle and the other shapes are pretty simple sources. You can set the shape size, you can set the color, you can make it a gradient, add a border, and all of the normal effects from the effects tab. You just select the rectangle, click and drag just like the text, and it makes a beautiful red rectangle. And now under the home tab, you can see we still have the normal options. You can make it yellow, you can make it purple, make it very pretty. You can add a border. You can also do this with the text as well. So let's say a 3 pixel wide, rounded, solid border. And let's make that border green. So now we've got a green border. Also, to see everything without any lines, you can just click and hold in a blank space right here between the sidebar and the canvas. You can also zoom the canvas, just as a fun fact. You can also turn on align lock and safe areas, if that's more your thing. Although I will say GT's align lock is kind of trash and buggy. So I usually just turn it off because it's not very good. Let me give you an example real quick, going off script. With align lock on, when you move stuff, yeah, see this? See how it's trying to snap to this edge here and my source inside is moving? This is not a temporary thing. The more and more I mess with this and keep moving it around, the more and more this purple rectangle will move into an incorrect place. You can see the width between these checker boards here. And now if I mess with it a bunch, the width will actually change. Okay, it only changed like a couple pixels, but it did change. It went like 3 pixels to the right. Depending on how many sources you have, it'll try to lock onto other sources and not just like thirds like it's doing here. So if you've got a whole bunch of sources and you have a line lock on, it'll try and lock on to so many different things, and stuff will just move inside of your layer and just completely change position. It's not designed that well. It's a bug that has been here since day one. I don't know if they're ever going to fix it. Let's hope so. So that's the shape. You can do all the normal stuff to it on the effects tab that we saw earlier. Shadows, reflections, skews, flipping it. Of course, it doesn't change because it's a rectangle. It's perfectly symmetrical. The other shapes are actually exactly the same as the rectangle. Here's an ellipse or a circle. You can make it locked to be a perfect circle by holding shift. And yeah, otherwise it is exactly the same as the square. And then you also have a triangle, which you can lock to be a perfect triangle by holding shift. And it's exactly the same as the rectangle and the circle. Next, we have the right triangle, which is exactly the same as the other previous shapes. You can hold shift when you create it to set the scaling to be perfectly even. Otherwise, it's the same as the other ones. Okay, done with the boring stuff. Let's get to something a little more interesting. So this is the image input. The image source is a very important input. Something to note, when you add an image, it will add it at 100% scale. So what this means is if you add a 64 by 64 pixel image, it will only take up 64 by 64 pixels on your canvas. If you were to drop an image into vMix, it'll scale it up to the full canvas size, whereas in GT, it keeps it at the exact size it's supposed to be. Here is a 1. Now, this is an image, a transparent PNG, and as you can see, it does not take up the full canvas. It was not scaled to perfectly fit. It came in at exactly the same size as the resolution of the image. Now, this is really important because if your designer gives you let's say a lower third PNG as a base for you to layer dynamic text on top of, you want that lower third to be perfectly scaled to not have any kind of weird blurring from scaling it up or scaling it down. You want it to be exactly as exported. With GT, that's exactly how it'll be. You have to actively scale it to change the size of it. Other than that, the image is the same as the other sources. You can change the opacity. You can change the reflection. You can do a full reflection. You can skew it, flip it. You can crop it, all that good stuff. The image has one other really good trick, a bonus feature, if you will. If you set the animation of an image to be an image sequence, it will automatically cycle through the next images in that folder in numerical order. You just have to name your images in a sequence, such as image 1, image 2, etc. The images are only detected when you first import the image, so make sure your final image sequence is ready to go before you import it into GT Title Designer. So let's show an example of that. I'm gonna get rid of this. So let's go back here, image sequence, rain, cloud 1, and etc. So here's my image. If I was to go to animations, I could, right now we're on transition in. We'll go over more animations at the end here. Let's say instead of all these other ones we do, image sequence. I can press play and you can see the images that I have in that folder automatically swap out with it and then it stops. And that's pretty cool. I'm sure many of you can think of cool uses for that. Like you could have your designer make you custom assets that animate only on animation in, and then you could have your text layer on top and have it do something cool and animate in. And that's a cool dynamic asset that you can adjust in real time with data sources. But there's another fun trick with this.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So I noticed that when the image 1 came in, it was larger and you sized it down. And then when you did image sequence, all of the images that cycled through were the same size as the one that you sized down. Is that normal? Does that always happen? So if you change the size of one, it causes all of the others to remain that same size? Okay.
So this image source will always be the source for all of the images in the sequence. They will all scale to fit within the bounds of this bounding box. So you can have different sized images. For example, if I swap this back to the 1, 2, 3, I specifically made this demo where these first two are 512 by 512, and then this 3 is 1024 by 1024. I mean, the 3 is also larger in relative size on the canvas, but if I was to play this, I think I need to re-add an image sequence 1, 2, 3, and it doesn't matter. Like it all fits within the bounding box. And show you another trick. So not only do we have transition in, transition out, page 1 through 10, which is very useful, continuous, data change in, data change out, and then data changes for every source. I have worked with GT titles that have 180 plus data sources in them. So that is, I think, 366 different in-out animations that are available. So this list gets very long, is what I'm saying. But continuous is the only one that differs. All of these are the same, except for continuous. Continuous is unique. And so we're going to show that early just because of that. Because there's one special feature, because we can do image sequence, and it will actually just loop it forever. So imagine you have a fun little weather graphic, and you stick this up in the corner to show the weather. I think that's super cute. And you can set the speed, you can make it very slow, or you can make it insanely fast. But yeah, this is a fun little feature. This was fun to make. I'm not very good at, I don't think anyone's good at animating in Photoshop. That's not exactly what it's made for, let's say. I was just dragging these raindrops around and exporting images over and over. But yeah, this is a fun example of image sequences in GT Title Designer. Another thing is when you save it, these will automatically be packed into the save, so you don't need to worry about file locations. Any assets used will be saved in GT Title Designer, so you don't need to worry about that. You can still add all of your effects, so we can do a full reflection, which is pretty fun. And then on top of that, if we wanted to, we could even do another continuous animation on the source. So now we've got a rotating, animating cloud in 3D because, like I said, GT Title Designer is actually 3D software. Even it's probably the worst 3D software there is, but it technically is 3D software. We can also change what it rotates around, what axis. This is probably making some of you dizzy. Apologize. This one's wild. Yeah, now we're just having fun. That is image sequence and the image source. Let's go on to 3D text, which is a source I have actually never used on a broadcast because I'm gonna be real, guys. I have never had someone be like, can I have text here but make it 3D? That has never been a request that I've gotten from a client. I can say that confidently. The only difference between text and 3D text is that under format, you have a depth. Ooh, depth. Look at that. It goes deep.
The reason no one's asked is because you didn't do this in the mid-2000s. That was the rage of productions then, but not now.
Good to know. We should bring it back. I think it's fun.
Make it 3D and spin.
Make it 3D. We're getting there. We're getting there. So 3D text is cool. So something to note, all of the 3D things in this are based on a viewport of this source. So the 3D view is the size of this bounding box. So if I was to size it up, you can see that it's way off to the left and the view is different. And then if I align it to the right, suddenly you see how it's converging towards the center. So this is like a really wide field of view, and then this is like a narrow field of view. Like Eddie was saying, we could totally just rotate it. Woo! Look at it go. Look at it go. So let me make it a little less thick. There we go. Change the font. Let's do whatever this one is. Yeah. And this is, this is fun, but not a lot of clients are going to ask for this. But this is where I wanted to demonstrate something else. If I pause this and I put it on a group layer, right? Now it's on a different layer than this cloud. Let's take this text, change the format. I'm going to rotate it a little bit so you can really see its 3D-ness. I mean, like, look at that. Yeah, this really is 3D software in a way. So I'm going to take that, and now I'm going to animate the parent layer, and you're going to see something interesting. So I'm going to have it rotate. Suddenly, it's not 3D anymore. How'd that happen? Now it looks like Paper Mario when I'm animating the parent layer. Something that you just need to remember and keep in mind is that this 3D text source is a viewport into 3D text, and then this group layer is a two-dimensional layer. Like group layers don't care about anything 3D. They are a flat plane with whatever sources are in it. So whenever it goes out to the group layer, it's flat. And that's just how it is. Like, you can animate a group layer to rotate in 3D space, and that works, but the layer itself is always a flat plane, no matter what. But so yeah, so if you ever want your 3D stuff to look 3D, you have to animate it on the source level, which can sometimes be a challenge. I'm going to do a real world demo of converting a real graphic from the real world into GT for you all once we finish going through these sources and what they do. All right, that's 3D text. It's cool. It does stuff. Don't use it, pretty much. Now we have the ticker. Let me make a new group layer. The ticker text it's a text source, and it is essentially identical from the regular text source, except it has one fun little feature under format. It has a type. So replace just means when you update the text, it completely replaces it. Add means when you update the text, it appends it to the existing ticker, which depending on your use case, you might want. But people generally go with replace because you usually, if you update the ticker, you want to just replace the whole thing. Additive is probably really only useful if like you've got results coming in and you want to add each result as they go. Something like that. But generally replace is the way to go. You can set which direction it scrolls, left, right, top, bottom, and the speed. And that's pretty much the only thing that separates it from the regular text source. Everything else here, it's all the same. Setting the spacing, center align. Now these ones don't really do anything because it scrolls from left to right. But everything else is basically the same. Make it go fast. Go faster. There it goes. And then as soon as it disappears, it's back. So that is the ticker text, useful for scrolling text if you need scrolling text, which is a common component of broadcast design generally. I don't think it's as common. It's mostly like a newsroom broadcast style type thing, but it's still relatively common. Next is the QR code. Have you ever wanted to generate a QR code but didn't want to go on one of those websites? Well, it's built in. It's super simple. You just set what text you want it to be. This can be done in vMix. You can even hook it up to a data source so it updates in real time, which is actually the coolest thing. If any of you were to scan this hello there, it would come up as hello there. You can see it changing in real time. It's very fast. Something I would recommend, you see how the more text I add, the bigger and more complicated the QR code gets. I would recommend trying to make your URLs as small as possible. So let's say you have a URL. Let's just say it's really long. Google.com, a bunch of nonsense, right? Like all that tracking stuff, like a really long Amazon link or something. They can often be this long. This QR code, not easy to scan. Don't make a QR code like this. It's terrible. That's a bit terrible idea. There's been times where I get a QR code from a client and I'm like, can we URL shorten this so that way people can actually scan it? If you hold your phone up to it, it takes your phone longer to recognize this finder pattern than it does for it to recognize this finder pattern. Like this, the base level QR code, I think it's called like V1 or something. How many characters do we need? Yep, there it goes. That's like, there we go. This is the smallest QR code you can get. Ideally, you want this. So a bit.ly/event name will usually get you in that ballpark. Definitely keep your QR code small. I don't know why they put so much padding on the edges. I do actually, so you can scan it easier, but you can crop it in if you wanted to. Not that I necessarily recommend that because it might not scan as easy, but you can do that. You can get rid of the feather to crop it into.
Change the background color to a different one so it fits better with the theme you have going on.
I wish. That would be very nice. I believe we could mask it though. If we had to. Let's do this live, everyone. Live demo. Masking just says what pixels are allowed through on a current layer. So let's get a rectangle going here. I don't think this is going to work because masking for this, I believe, is just which one allows it through and not the other way around. Yeah. It's not a black-white mask. It is just if the pixel exists, mask it, and if it doesn't exist, don't mask it. So you can see we have rectangle 1 currently masked to QR code 1. So now rectangle 1 only appears where there are solid pixels of QR code 1. Now to unmask it, it becomes full size. So masking is useful, for sure. You can even mask text, although I don't know why GT title isn't very good at it. But yeah, use masking if you need to. There's also gradients, which I would recommend using. Can set this to a gradient, set your rectangle to a gradient. There's tons of options in GT Title Designer. Let's see, what's a good color? This one, get rid of the alpha. Always watch out for your alpha. Apply, boom, look at that. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. I accidentally sort of made the buy flag. That's okay. It's one of the better flags. All right, so yes, sadly you cannot change the background on this. You could probably change the background in vMix because vMix does have a traditional black-white masking system. So you could add this as a layer in vMix and layer it on top of a background and set your mask, and that would likely work. But in terms of GT Title Designer, you're kind of out of luck. That's masking, that's the QR code. Let's move on. That's all of the sources, and that's more or less how to use them. Now let's go into a real-world example. Photoshop file from Supergirl Gamer Pro. Here it is. It's a Valorant in-game overlay. Pretty standard. There's a whole lot of sources in the site. Oh yeah, I should probably mention, kind of an important feature is you can just import a Photoshop file. But the reason I'm bringing it into Photoshop first is because, well, here, let's make a new one. Make sure it's exactly the same size as your Photoshop canvas for one. Let's try and import it. Valorant in-game. Raster data is not found, so import PSD. What does that mean? No raster data? That's weird. Basically, the developers didn't bother making any kind of custom scripting to convert things for you. You have to do it yourself. So unless everything is absolutely perfect in the Photoshop file, it just throws an error and says it won't do it. I wish they would update it so that way it would just fix it for you. Like, oh no, there's a layer out of place. Well, just move it and then import it. Like, why can't we do that? But anyway, here's an example of a Photoshop file you might get from a client. So basically what our goal is to make this work with GT Title Designer. How do we do that? Well, the first thing is that you have to organize the layers exactly like GT Title Designer, which is one group layer and then only single sources within that group layer. You cannot put groups inside groups. It has to be group layer, sources. So in Photoshop, that would be folder and then sources. No folders and folders, not allowed. It will not import. It'll say no. The next thing is that you need to make sure your Photoshop file is canvas sized to exactly 1920 by 1080 or another supported resolution that your GT is currently set to. Here are all of the ones that GT supports. 720p, 1080p, vertical 1080p, 4K, and then 8K, which actually is a more recent thing. The other thing is that you need to be using 8 bits per channel for your color. Image mode, 8 bits per channel. If you do anything else, it will be so upset and yell at you. The next thing, organize your Photoshop file so that way everything is neatly within folders. Now this is gonna take forever, so I have already done it in this Photoshop file. So I have reorganized all of the sources to be in single top-level folders that correspond to each individual element on the graphic. They were a little mixed up coming into this, but you can see as I show and hide each one that they separate. These are separate because they're going to be separate in the final thing. They're logos that are gonna loop. So now let's convert it. So this still won't import because we have a bunch of stuff that is unimportable. So what's unimportable? Well, things like layer styles. So this text, we have to right click it, rasterize layer style. This rectangle, rasterize layer style. Regular rectangles and images will import, but anything with layer styles applied absolutely will not. Sometimes it just won't import anyway. I think there's an issue on the latest version of Photoshop where GT Title throws a critical error even on some save files that realistically should import, but just refuse to. Okay, those all look good. Let's save it. Something to note is when you save a Photoshop file that you have converted, is usually good to save as and rename it to something like converted or prepped. At Spacetime, we always say a prepped PSD. That's just how it's always been here. So let's give it a try now. This is a live demo. Prepped Valorant in game. Please wait. The most recent error that gets thrown is a more recent phenomenon, so hopefully it doesn't happen. I still can't figure out why it's happening. Yay, it worked. Sometimes you'll get a critical error. If you get an error you absolutely cannot figure out, what I have found is that you need to get rid of all the text. For some reason, certain text sources in certain Photoshop files just don't play nice. And that's been a more recent thing. I cannot figure it out. But if you remove all your text, which is unfortunate, it'll work. All right. So the first thing that sticks out to me is that all these logos are piled up. Generally, you would not use GT Title Designer to rotate through logos. So we should delete this layer, which will get rid of all of the logos.
So what would you use?
Well, what I use? Well, you could use the slideshow feature in vMix. So you would export all of these images separate and throw them in a slideshow in vMix. Or if you want to be fancy, because the slideshow feature is not ideal, it only overlays the next image and then cuts the image behind it when it switches between images. So it's not an ideal solution. I would probably go for like throwing it in a video editor and making really nice, pretty fades between them. Something like After Effects is perfect for that. That's what I would do. Next up is to make sure all of your text looks good. Something that you will be endlessly frustrated is that when you zoom in, all of the UI elements scale with it. So it is very, very difficult to actually see what's going on right now. But you can usually work around it. So here's a good way to make text ready. So let's take this text box. I'm gonna expand it. It's really hard to see. So I'm just gonna mangle it a little. I'm gonna expand the group layer. Make sure your align lock is off. Remember what I said earlier? Align lock likes to just destroy things. So as long as align lock is off, you're good to move things around. Now we can see. In order to make this team name work properly, I mean, it'll work right now. If I was to just place it in the right spot, it'll work just fine. But if there's a team that's name is longer, it'll do that. It'll go off, it'll line break. So that we don't want that. In this case, what we want is a right aligned center, whatever it's called. I'm not a text expert. And then what we want is we want it to shrink. And normally you'd think, oh, that's fine, we're good to go. Most of the time when you import text from Photoshop, the line spacing will be royally screwed up. The text will often even disappear completely when you set that setting. So what you have to do is adjust the line spacing until the text is perfectly aligned with the middle of the box. Because if it's aligned with the top and you add text, it'll move down instead of staying in the middle, which is not probably what you want. So make sure it is perfectly centered. Unless you want it to shrink by moving upwards, that might be something you want. But if you want it to stay perfectly in the middle, the text has got to stay like that. So adjust your bounding box. You can see now it shrinks correctly. Adjust your bounding box to where you like it. Make sure it's good, and that looks solid. And we can do that with the other one. A way to save time, though, is to just kind of roughly adjust the layer. Also, we have to unlock the layer in order to adjust its size, by the way. I don't think I mentioned, but you can lock and unlock layers. Very useful. I'm sure you're all familiar with that from OBS and Photoshop, and really any creative tool whatsoever has layer locking. So yeah, just unlock your layers. Then we can just delete this. And then we can take this, bring it over to this one, paste, and now we have a text source that just needs one setting adjusted, bloop, left align, and then use the arrow keys to kind of shimmy it into place, and then you're good. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's not exactly precise. Now, is it? And no, for this demo, we are keeping it kind of rough. If you did want precision, because not only is this not precise, the way that it imports already moves text around. So I would recommend exporting an image, layering that either on top or below, And now you can see a reference of what it's supposed to look like and what yours looks like. So you can just toggle between the reference export from Photoshop. And that's what I do to make sure things are perfectly aligned at the end. But for now, we're not gonna worry about that. Let's do one of the score boxes. Sometimes getting the right thing selected can be a real pain, but it is what it is. So this is technically called Name 5. It can be a good idea to rename stuff in Photoshop just because it can be a little bit easier. But yeah, we're going to turn off text wrapping, set it to shrink, set the line spacing. Might need to make it a little bit bigger, set the align to middle. And now technically you could probably not bother with this because 0 is generally the widest character, except for some 7s. I found some 7s are wider than some 0s. But generally numbers don't expand that much. But now, if for some reason we had a 4-digit number, we're set. It's good to just, even though it in all likelihood would never change and never be a problem, just setting all your text boxes to shrink and scale correctly, it's just always a good idea. You should just be prepared for anything.
You should also think about the game that this is currently being built for. What is the maximum score? So this was built for Valorant. What is the maximum score should show up?
Well, it depends on if you're counting in-game score or series score. But in-game score is always counted on the in-game UI anyway. The scores on these are almost always a series score.
You're going to be more common for Valorant to do a best of 1 or a best of 3 versus in a Rocket League you'll do best of 5s, a best of 7s.
Yes, and a more common setup for Rocket League is using ticks instead of numbers to determine the series score. In Rocket League, on the overlay, there's a lot of numbers going on. There's a timer, there's the goals of the current game, and then you also have the series score. So they just use like lit up lines for it in Rocket League generally. Next up, so these are pretty much done. We have the left icon, right icon. Generally what you would do, now I'm not going to do it here because we're not getting into data sources this time, is you would want to replace the icon. You would want to delete it and then re-add it in GT Title Designer. The reason for that being an image from Photoshop is not always an image in GT Title Designer. Now, sometimes you can get away with going into data and unchecking hidden, so that way it appears in vMix, so you can set it to a dynamic data source. But that doesn't always work correctly. So if you want it to be perfect, then I would recommend deleting it and adding in the PNG manually and aligning it. Usually I add the new PNG, align it so it looks identical, and then delete the old one. But yeah, that's how we would do it. And we would do it for both sides, and that would be the only edit here. We also have this little part of the graphic here. So we've got group 1, finals. So let's make sure align lock is off. Yes, it is. Unlock the group, expand it. So group 1, finals. See, it's not exactly aligned well. You could just leave it like that, but if you show anything other than group 1, it's going to be way off center. So just like all the other ones, we gotta center, turn off text wrapping, and shrink. I clicked those buttons so many times in a row, I can do it so fast now. Center, no text wrapping, shrink. And then set your line spacing so it's nice and centered again. Sometimes it can help to set it to side, so that way you can set the line spacing easier until it lines up just right. And then set it back to center. Whoops, there we go. Something to note, you can only use the arrow keys on a source after you literally click it in the canvas. If you click it on the side here, you can't adjust it with arrow keys. You have to click it with this, which can sometimes be a problem because let's say you wanted to move multiple sources at the same time with arrow keys. Sometimes that's hard because you could select them all in here and then try and move it and nothing happens. A fun trick that I've learned is you can move them with your mouse imprecisely and then press Control-Z to snap them back, and then suddenly they work with the arrow keys. Ta-da! So if you needed to move a bunch of objects 1 pixel over, drag them, Control-Z, arrow key, bam, and that's it. Fun little workaround. But yeah, center, shrink, line spacing, that's good. Throw the finals back in there. Again, we would use our reference image to make sure that we're aligned. That's pretty close. And then that's done. Just make sure it says group 2 again. I think it had a hashtag or a pound sign. Okay, this is pretty much done. Because these are all static elements, we don't need to worry about these. So, in fact, if you wanted to make sure that these looked perfect, you could even rasterize these in Photoshop. So you would just right-click a layer and then go to, let me make sure I can select that. You would go to rasterize type. So now it literally cannot import wrong. But this is editable text still. Even though it doesn't need to be. It is easier to just make it non-editable. So this is all one big layer. Let's animate this now. This is a done overlay. Let's go, guys. So animation time. Animation is very fun, very critical. Probably the best part of GT Title Designer, honestly. For this one, I'm feeling just a simple fly. Let's go. I'm gonna animate the group layers. So this group layer up here. Remember, you can animate either the sources or the group layer. Generally, animating the group layer is easier. The default duration is 1 second. I'm going to set that to cubic easing in out. And if you play it, you can see, woo, flies in. You can see it comes off the canvas, which is kind of annoying. If you don't want to see that, you can just, in the bottom right here, click Fit to Window. And now you won't see that anymore. It'll look correct. And then over that same time, we can do another fly on this right team. Make it cubic easing in out. And now they both perfectly fly in at the same time. Very nice, very fun. And then we can do the same with the icons. This is not a very complex animation, but it doesn't need to be. It really doesn't need to be. Bam. That looks pretty good. And then this group 2 thing, maybe we can make that fly in from the top, add a little 1 second delay just so it's a little late, or maybe make the duration a little faster because it has less distance to travel. So relatively, it'll be moving slow. So boom, bam, ta-da. So that's pretty fun. And if you wanted to, you could even animate this bottom bit. I wouldn't animate this here because if you think about it, it's going to have a looping source inside of vMix that will always be on. So we'd have to coordinate the animation of the GT with like a layer showing and hiding in vMix. It would be a whole thing. So it's much better just to have the logo loop permanently there. In the case of Valorant, because the entire purpose of this bottom left block is to cover the chat, just gonna leave that there. Not gonna animate it. So that way we can go into game, we can, it shows the teams, and then bam, these fly in. If you wanted to make it manual, you could even make it so that in vMix, it doesn't automatically play with transition. You can make it so you have to manually animate it in. So that way, once you go in game, you have to just, manually do it. You wait until it feels right. Transition out, same as transition in. A few quirks with that is that the directions are switched. You have to think of transition out as just backwards transition in. So if we want it to fly out the way it came in, we would use the same arrow direction. So in this case, that would be the left arrow that is pointing to the right. So normally you'd think, oh yeah, I want it to go out to the left, so I'd use this one. That's the way the arrow is pointing. But no. See? The left arrow, the arrow pointing right makes it go left. So transition out just does what transition in does, but in reverse. That's a good way to think about it. And same thing for this. You can make them both go out. Bam. Same with this one. Fly out. This one, fly out. If you ever wonder what I'm doing here at Spacetime, it's this. A lot of it's this. For hours. Battle of the Brands took me weeks of this. An in-game overlay, you might not even animate. It's not exactly high on the priority list. You would most likely be animating other graphics, information graphics. So I have some examples to show you. Here is a leaderboard. Give it 1 second. From this same series, Supergirl Gamer Pro. This is from the Fortnite. And this one is a lot harder because as you can see here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 text sources per row, 10 rows. That is 70 text sources. All of them need to be linked to data except for the first row. This could just be baked because it's just number 1 through 10. And I did that. And it was a good time, honestly. Like, this is kind of the fun part for me. Here's the animation I made for it. These fly in, it pauses as 8, gives the line, and then the last 2 come in. The reason there's a line is showing the prizing cutoff. So the animation pauses to reflect that. So we get our top 8, line, bottom 2. Relatively simple animation, but still solid, in my opinion. And I'll show you all of those data change animations list. Woo! Look at that list. That is this one. There's no animation out because we always stinger away from this. So having an out didn't even really make sense. Certain broadcasts you'll want an animation out, certain broadcasts you won't. That's just how it is. Let's look at one more example real quick before I give an example of a data change animation. Then after that, we can do some questions. Here is one from Battle of the Brands. This is a player bio. And this one is fun because it's on a transparent background, just like the in-game overlay. And what this allowed us to do was to animate it in and then back out, and then animate the next one right back in again without needing to transition. So it was just an animated background this was on top of. So it's super clean. Super clean. Goes in, goes out, next one comes in. All of these are relatively dynamic. We've got the Taco Bell icon. This is a text source. This is a text source. Text, 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 text. Image of the Polaroid background, and then the streamer icon. It's rotated. So this one was a bit of a complicated one to do. One of the main reasons being that I couldn't just animate the group layer because they are layered behind each other. So this bio has to be here before everything gets in, because vMix can only do one thing at a time. There's no keyframes, there's no nothing. It's just, what's the animation? Do it. There is 1, 2, 3 here. I would really not recommend using it other than really basic things. It's so buggy. It's unbelievably buggy. It does work, but it doesn't work for something like this. All it really does is, let me just give you an example real quick. New layer. We're just going to mangle this real quick. Text. So I could do fly in, cubic easing in, out, right? And then on number 2, I could do fade with a half-second delay, cubic easing in, out. Now it'll fly in and fade. You see that there? Let me make it slightly more seeable. Watch for the text. See how it kind of fades and flies in? That's what the 1, 2, 3 is for. They all happen simultaneously. It's not a steps system. It is a all of the animations at once type thing. And you can delay some of them to make it more of a step thing, but they all happen at once. It's incredibly buggy. If you do any custom time durations, switching between them will overwrite and reset your time. It's really not fun. So try and avoid it. Use it sparingly. But yeah, try and avoid it. Next thing would be a data change animation. The simplest example I can think of is, let's just go back to this other one here. Oh, I didn't think I set data change animations on this. Apparently I did. Good job, me, for doing that. It was probably not necessary. So I guess past me set data change animations so that way anytime any element on any row gets updated, it just updates the whole row. So yeah, that's what that looks like. If any element gets updated on this row, it fades the whole row in and out. Data change animations are very powerful. They're very good. They're very nice. They add a lot to the quality of the broadcast, especially when it comes to things like leaderboards, overlays, dynamic information. We'll get into data sources and spreadsheets next time. But that was about it for GT Title Designer. I don't think I missed anything. I crawled through this and made notes. We didn't really go into styles, I guess. I looked at it and I was like, nobody really uses this. All it does is just, there's a few presets for like some weird gradients and corner rounding. You could do it if you wanted to. These are the ones, and it just applies it to your source. That's about it. They're really not that useful to me. Maybe you want it, but not super useful. I will take unlimited numbers of questions, but yeah, that's GT Title Designer. Feel free to reach out to me for questions if you're ever working on a project.
From a kind of a thought process of, you've gone from Photoshop to this, and then it imports into vMix. What happens, for example, if I've done all this work, just hypothetically, the client decides, Intel did a rebrand, new color scheme. Is that something you just have to scrap it all and re-import a new PSD? Or is there a way to do that without, like, is there a way to keep all of the things you set, but change some of the layers as far as color?
It's kind of complicated. It really depends on what you're working with. You can see that my background layers here are set to picture, meaning that they are raster data. They are not colors that I can change. Even though in Photoshop they're just shapes with colors, GT doesn't know what this shape is. Like it only knows rectangles, circles, and triangles. It doesn't know this weird slanted square. So it just imports it as an image, essentially. So what that means is that you are going to have to redo some of your work. Now, you don't have to redo necessarily all of it. If it was especially a graphic that had tons of text on it, for example, you could just go into Photoshop and export the backgrounds. So like you could hide the text, take this layer, right click it, and export it as PNG, and then layer that behind your text, and just do that for each one of your areas. That way you don't have to redo your text. If you've already linked all your data sources in vMix, you don't need to relink your data sources. Everything's solid. Also, data source linking in vMix is tied to names. So I would recommend having a good naming scheme for this, like team underscore L or something. You can only have like 14 characters in the name, so keep it relatively short. But yeah, these are your identifiers when you're linking data, so make sure these have solid names. Anyone else?
I have another one.
Okay.
What happens if I'm given a Photoshop document and I import it and the text looks drastically different?
In that case, which happens a lot, that is, well, I wouldn't say a lot, but it happens sometimes. You would use the reference image technique that I showed earlier, where you just export the Photoshop file, get the reference image, and then you'd probably have to end up making custom text. So adding a new layer, adding text, and just adjusting the font, adjusting the size, adjusting the bold and all those values until you get it as close as humanly possible. Now, there is one setting that GT Title does not have, and that is, well, there's a lot of settings it doesn't have, but there's one in particular that it doesn't have that makes life difficult, which is the spacing, the text spacing. So let's say team name here was extra wide spacing, right? Where's that? Can I not do that? Oh, there we go. No, it's working. So yeah, now team name is extra wide. Let's make it 200. So wide. And like that's a stylistic choice. That's cool. That's not a thing in GT Title Designer, unfortunately. There are workarounds, something you can do. It's a little silly, but Glypher Studio is your friend. So this is a easy to use text editor app. I use this for making mono versions of fonts. So you know how when you have a timer text, which is also a GT title, by the way, you should make your timer in GT, which is just one text source. When you have a timer, every single letter width is different. So the timer will like bounce around a little, which is no good. That's ugly. We want the timer to be locked in place. So I use Glypher Studio, and I can adjust the width of different glyphs as each letter is called. Each character is called a glyph. And yeah, you can adjust the width. And in the case of the wide text, you could even export a whole new font of just this font, but with the letters spaced more apart. So that is a workaround that you could do. Or if it works out that having one spacebar between all of the letters kind of worked out to doing the spacing right. You could even program it on your spreadsheet to put a space between every letter. You could do like a regex extract or something and put a space between. It would be a complicated formula, but you could make a spreadsheet formula that puts a space between all the characters and adds an extra space to any existing spaces. That's pretty close to how it looked in Photoshop right there. So that's another workaround you could do. For putting the text closer together, it's really just Glypher Studio, making a whole new font, and then importing it in here. It's kind of silly and dumb, but that is really the only workaround until they decide to add more text features, because there really isn't enough text features. Worst case scenario, you can export PNGs of your text and just have a list of, how many teams are you realistically going to have on a broadcast? Like maybe 100, but probably more like 10 or 20. You could export every single team name text as a PNG, put them in a list, reference that list, and use images in your GT title that update dynamically instead, which is a lot more work, a whole lot more work. But the client wants what the client wants, and you make it happen.
The one thing is, like, I was referencing an issue I run into all the time, and you went and gave a whole bunch more information. But one of the things I run into when doing this a lot is client gives file. They use some weird font. Photoshop automatically is able to find that, and I'm able to use it in Photoshop. But because I don't have it installed on my full computer, GT is like, eh. So that was what I was going to. The most common issue I use is fonts not installed.
I believe there is a way to get it from like Adobe's weird thing, but also you should just always ask your designers for fonts. I always make sure to ask for fonts now because I've gotten no fonts so many times. You can usually find the fonts by just Googling for them, like 90% of the time. And if you really want to get creative, you can go on font websites that display the font in text form, like this. I don't know, this is a font, right? I mean, you could just inspect that, go to application, or go to network, refresh the page, sort by font. Here's a WAF file, and let me just, and then if you're doing this in Firefox, you can grab a curl command that will refetch this file with all of your cookies and all of the headers. And then you just run that in command prompt, and it dumps it into your system folder. And then you take that WAF file and then throw it into a WAF to OTF converter. And then suddenly you have a .otf file of the font you need. That is a desperation move, though. I wouldn't recommend that. Also because it's legally weird. I mean, your client has permission to use the font, so it's not like that's bad. But doing that is a little weird. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. Get the font from your client. Usually you can find it through regular Googling, and in desperation you can get it like that. But Adobe doesn't make things easy. Adobe always makes things hard.
Well, there is the often common thing where you open it up in Photoshop, everything's fine, but when you import it, it's an Arial or whatever the default is for GT, and that means, just as a quick, easy thing, you don't have the font.
Not always. Not always. Sometimes you'll import a file, and it'll show up as Arial, and it'll say it's the font in here, but you actually need to go through, scroll down, and then select it. Because sometimes, I don't know, it's another one of GT's weird bug quirks. Sometimes it's here. You just have to go manually click it. These ZumiSoft ones, specifically for Supergirl, these ones are real troublesome. These ones often do not appear when you import GT Title Designer. They just, I don't know if it's this little pointy finger or something, but something about it when you import it, sometimes it just refuses. But yeah, sometimes it's not having the font. Sometimes it's just in the list. You have to go do it yourself. Fonts are a continuous nightmare. Fonts have eaten many hours of my life trying to fix. So hopefully get your client to give you the font and to not use weird spacing in Photoshop. And if it's close enough, like if it's like a few pixels off, sometimes it's okay. But you should get that approved. Send a picture of the final graphic, be like, here it is. Everything looked good? Yep, solid.
What's the next training?
next training will be taking these GT titles and putting them into use in vMix and how data sources work, how to link data sources, decent spreadsheet layouts, how to use the tool that I created to pull spreadsheets really fast, stuff like that.
Will you cover it pulling from Excel and Google Sheets, or just one of them?
Probably just Google Sheets. Excel is just easier. It'll be the same in Excel. You'll just point it towards a CSV file instead of, it'll be a CSV file in both cases because my tool exports Google Sheets to a CSV file. But it'll be pretty much the same. You'll just not do the weird data rotation that I do. That's about it. Any other final questions before we head out for the evening?
No, just wanted to say I appreciate you hosting. Thank you so much.
Now you can help me, Justin.
Ta-da!
With that, the event is officially over. Thank you all for joining and learning.